Hello and welcome to Unprofessional Engineering. My name is James.
And you got Luke.
Luke, we're continuing our Companies That Built the World series, this time focusing on not one, not two, but three companies that built the world.
And we just did this because I think there's going to be a lot of repetition in the three of these.
Yeah, and their histories are kind of intermingled.
Interwoven, per se.
Interwoven. And the three are the big three: Ford, GM, and Chrysler.
Yeah. Have you owned any one of those three vehicles?
I have not had a Chrysler. I've owned the other two flavors.
You've had a Ford and...
The wife has a Ford.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have a Chevy/GM.
I think I owned a Chevy Blazer one time.
Oh, yeah.
And
those were real popular.
I've never owned a Ford, and I don't think I've ever... And I had a Chrysler.
Did you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I did have a Chrysler. It's in my notes. That's right. I did have a Chrysler.
So if you peoples want to learn more about this and you're tired of our voices already, head to aroundmichigan.com or history.com/news/the cars that made America, which have a great breakdown about the cars that made America.
I would imagine that the Ford F-150's got to be on the list.
I would think so, right?
Okay.
It's
I got some fun notes on that one.
Ooh, about the F-150 in particular?
It's basically one note.
Okay, so let's get started with where it all began for those three.
Henry Ford invented the car.
For those of you who haven't checked out our Henry Ford episode, go do so, and you will find out that he did not, in fact, invent the car.
See what I did there?
I liked it. You really led me strong. So, of course, since we're talking about Ford, GM, and Chrysler, we are not going to talk about any of them for the start of this history. Because that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
In 1886, Ransom E. Olds received a patent for the first car that ran on gasoline. How about that fun fact?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he founded his first company, Olds Motor Vehicle Company, in Lansing.
Guess. That became Oldsmobile.
Look at you. You are so smart.
Pow.
Pow is
That's
right.
my brain's working.
1899, Olds sold Olds Motor Vehicle Company and moved to Detroit to open Olds Motor Works, where he built the apparently famous, I don't know, curved dash Oldsmobile. My first car was an Oldsmobile. Yeah.
I think I knew you when you had that.
I did, old Goldie.
Yeah.
Ah.
That was an ugly car.
Yeah, it was not pretty. It was not pretty. So meanwhile, in Pontiac, Edward Murphy founded the Pontiac Buggy Company in 1893. It's really interesting how many buggy companies and stuff are part of this history. He began producing cars 14 years later, so he must have been pretty successful with his buggies. And it was called the Oakland Motor Car Company. Okay, so now enters our buddy Ford.
Okay.
Henry Ford.
He invents the car.
He invents the car right now. So check out our episode on that if you haven't. You get all the deets on him.
Yep.
The good and the bad.
Yep.
I'll leave it at that. You really should listen to that one. So in that episode, you'll find out that he actually had two company failures: the Detroit Automobile Company and Henry Ford Company, before being successful with Ford Motor Company, which started in 1903. Pretty interesting.
Right before that, he was with the Detroit Auto, and it only lasted 1 year. He was with the Detroit Automobile Company, and he left after a year.
Yeah, there's some problems going on there.
Yeah, and right before that, so back in 1896, he builds the first quadricycle.
Ooh, tell me about that quadricycle.
The quadricycle. So it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the ugliest vehicle you've ever seen. So basically, it's a 4 horsepower. So imagine like your lawnmower engine, right? And it's connected to basically a buggy that has bicycle wheels at the corners. It had 2 forward gears and 1 reverse gear.
Wow. It had a reverse gear?
It did have a reverse gear, which was, I think that was, at the time, that was kind of one of the more innovative things that he did. It had a reverse gear. Because I think previously, if you wanted your car to go in reverse, you had to get out and push it.
Yeah, which is pretty great.
Yeah.
I can just imagine that going well, especially since all these cars are being built in Michigan, which is super good in the snow to get out and push in. So a month after Ford Motor Company started, they produced their first car, which is pretty impressive. And then just 5 years later, they launched the Model T. And I would think that's probably the most impactful, famous vehicle ever, right?
Impactful is kind of an understatement, James. Do you know how many of those were created?
If I were going to round it off,
I
would say 15,007,034.
That's not rounding it, but
Maybe they made a fraction
They
of one?
produced the Model T from 1908, like you mentioned, all the way up until 1927.
That's a long run.
It was considered like the everyday family car. It was economically priced because I guess back then having a car was a major extravagance, and cars were super expensive. So the Model T was like, it was basically like the Chevy Cavalier of.
Yeah. Did you ever have a Cavalier?
I did.
Did you? One of my buddy's
didn't.
brothers had one, and my buddy, when he got his license, immediately got in an accident with it and totaled it. Because that's what happens. Interesting thing here, another fun fact for you. Even though the Henry Ford Company wasn't great at first, now keep in mind that was his second go at it, not Ford Motor Company.
Yep.
Henry Ford Company turned into Cadillac Car Company.
Ooh.
How about that?
Yeah, we did. We talked about that.
Yeah.
So in 1913, so he's making these Model Ts, right? And guess how long it took to make a typical Model T back then?
I don't even know.
It took about 12 and a half hours because the moving assembly line had yet to be invented. So in 1913, Ford innovates with a moving assembly line where the workers stay stationary and the vehicle itself moves from one location to another location. And they go from 12 and a half hours to make a Model T down to an hour and a half.
So first off, 12 and a half hours don't feel so bad.
It doesn't back then,
and
right?
then an hour and a half?
That's bananas.
That's crazy. They're pumping those suckers out.
Yeah, they are.
So around the same time that Ford's happening, around that time, the dirty water capital of America, Flint, Michigan, earned the nickname the Vehicle City, which apparently was not the dirty water capital city, because of its horse-drawn carriage production. So in 1886, William Durant, who is just all over this stuff, founded the Flint Road Cart Company, later named Durant Dort Carriage Company, and became the largest producer of horse-drawn carriages in America. So this comes into play later on here, because who cares about his horse-drawn carriages, right? So in 1903, David Buick, all these names, incorporated Buick Motor Company in Detroit and was bought in 1903 by Flint Wagon Works. And the company launched the Model B Buick that year, which apparently was another very famous vehicle throughout the timeline. So in 1908, Buick led the U.S. in automobile production, which is crazy. And that same year, Durant founded General Motors in Dirty Water, Flint.
And he bought everybody.
Yeah, he bought he bought Buick, he bought Oldsmobile, and he just wanted to, I would say, build a monopoly here, right? He wanted to just get all of these brands in there.
I think he bought Cadillac as well.
Yeah. So within 2 years, GM acquired 30 companies, also including that Oakland Motor Car Company and Cadillac. But it turns out Billy here, who was the head of the company at the time, got the boot because he was overspending, big time. So that didn't discourage old Billy.
Nope.
No. So in 1911, he began a small car company.
Just a small one,
named Chevrolet. With the help of retired friend and colleague from Buick, and apparently a race car driver, Louis Chevrolet. Louis? L-O-U-I-S.
We'll go with Louis.
Okay. So Mr. Chevrolet, how about that? Durant incorporated the Chevy Motor Company that November. And so this is probably the craziest part of the history to me. So somehow Mr. Overspending turns this thing into a super huge success. And with the help of investors like the DuPont company, Chevrolet bought enough GM stock to gain control of the company in 1915.
In 1916, he came back as the president.
Yeah, so he was overspending. He gets the boot. It's I can still do this. Does it so well and gets investors that he buys back the people that kicked him out.
That feels like a Steve Jobs kind of thing. Didn't Steve Jobs get the boot and then they called him back?
Yeah, they were floundering.
Check out the Steve Jobs episode.
Nicely done, Luke.
I don't do those very well usually.
But you did it well that time.
Thank you.
So, like you said, Durant came back in and he attempted to expand GM for a second time. And this time his efforts clashed with dropping auto sales, which is just unfortunate. And DuPont saved GM from bankruptcy, which, is a common theme here. But once again, Durant got the boot in 1920 for overspending. Wah, wah. Be that a lesson to you. Don't overspend.
Be that a lesson.
Brianna. Good thing she doesn't listen. Fun fact before we take a break.
Shoot.
The GM founder managed a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan, until he died. What? Right? Because why is that
Where
something?
do you find these?
I don't know.
Okay.
But see, I feel like that's perfect for like, you're hanging out at cocktail hour and you're like, he got the boot and then he managed a bowling alley.
Yep.
All right, so let's take a break for this week's word from our sponsor.
So based off of the Corvette that's parked out in front of my house right now that is yours, I can only assume that Chevy is the sponsor, and they gave you that Corvette for the show.
Along with that and the Silverado that I give them money for, or at least gave them money for, they were not willing to supply me with any cash money for this. But we do have also no shout-outs. Wah, wah. Now, why, you might ask? That's because I wanted to take this time to let everyone know that Unprofessional Engineering has been successfully nominated as one of the top podcasts in Pittsburgh.
Ooh.
If you Google
City Paper
or the best of PGH or the best of Pittsburgh 2019, you can find your way to best local podcast and vote for Unprofessional Engineering. So if you love us as much as we love you, go do that, because we will become rich and famous if you do that.
Well, our competition, I looked at the competition. I don't know if we're going to be rich and famous.
They probably have a lot more friends than us, though.
They do.
Our listeners, we're depending on you. Don't worry about having not listened to them. Don't worry about not living in Pittsburgh. Just go vote for us.
Vote.
Also, feel free to email us at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com.
We'll send you some sweet stickers.
Oh, amazing stickers. Subscribe and review. Go on iTunes or wherever you listen. We're almost to 100 reviews, which is going to be a big celebration.
I feel like we've been saying that for like the last 3 months.
Yeah, it's been a while. So go do all that.
Cool.
All right, let's move on, Luke.
Moving on.
So where did we leave off?
You left. So I think.
The bowling alley.
Yeah,
right?
the bowling alley cat. Yeah.
So, like all good things in life, war made things even better.
Yeah.
Right? So, for some reason, war happened, and this led to more success for the automobile. Specifically, in this case, World War I, where horses were still used a whole bunch, which just kind of blows my mind. I feel like the Civil War was when horses stopped being useful, but it turns out they were still used here in World War I. And since a whole bunch of them died, like millions of them in the field, they started using cars more. So the UK's, how would I say this, Vauxhall? Maybe the X isn't pronounced, but that's okay. It produced the D-type, which began to be used by the high-ranking officers and royalty for transportation outside of direct conflict. So, save them with the nice vehicles, let the horses die. So even before the U.S. entered the war, though, Ford Motor Company's British factories began pumping out cars and trucks for the war effort, and many American car companies started changing their production from, hey, people, come buy our cars, to making airplane engines or other vehicles for battle. And so then when the war ended, 2 out of every 5 vehicles in the United Kingdom were Fords.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that helped out.
This is World War I.
This was the old Onezo. Yep.
The Onezo.
Yeah. So finally, I know I'm talking a lot, but feel free to chime in.
Oh,
whenever.
no.
Okay.
You're good.
Finally, after the war ended, the little brother of the big 3 shows up.
Chrysler.
I mean, it's just so disappointing, Chrysler, right? I mean, I guess they probably don't think so. But so Walter Chrysler, once the head of GM's Buick division, which is, all these things tied
1925,
together.
right?
Yeah, in 1925, made the Chrysler Corporation, headquartered in lovely Detroit, Michigan. Yeah. Chrysler became known for its mid-priced cars and impressive performance engineering and terrible management.
Fun fact.
Ooh, I want this.
So back in 1924-25, they actually had some pretty crazy innovations. The first one was they had an air carburetor filter. They had
in 1925?
In 1925.
Wow.
They had high compression engines and the very first mass-produced 4-wheel hydraulic brake system.
Wow.
So even though Chryslers were kind of terrible, at least the ones I had experience with, they had some pretty interesting inventions and things that they designed for their cars. And like you said, these were all, I'd say, mid-priced, average-priced cars.
Yeah, and I think that's a recurring theme that you end up seeing throughout Chrysler's history is their engineering is really pretty good.
Yeah.
And they come up with a lot of interesting, cutting-edge kind of stuff, but the management of the company has just been very poor throughout history.
As a good friend of mine says, terrible.
Terrible.
1930, they invent Mopar, who is still around today.
Mopar?
Who's
like Mopar?
Mopar parts. You know Mopar parts?
I don't.
So Mopar became their vehicle parts division. And like when you go to Advanced Auto or any of these.
I don't do those things.
Okay. When I go to Advanced Auto or when I go to, a place to get automotive parts, they Mopar parts are still around. They're huge.
Couple fun facts back in time a little bit. The Walter Chrysler financed the construction of the Chrysler Building in 1928, which was the world's tallest building at the time of its completion.
Another fun fact.
Ooh.
Did you know that Chrysler made the converters for the Manhattan Project?
No.
Yep.
Speaking of the Manhattan Project, we have an episode all about that. Go check it out.
I don't know what converters are, but they made them.
I feel like it was instrumental.
I'm sure it was.
In winning World War II.
I'm sure.
Fun fact number 2. And then we'll talk about World War II a little bit.
Shoot.
By 1929, this is crazy, the Big Three made up 75% of automobile sales in America.
That makes sense, I think, right?
Yeah, but I mean, there were still the little companies out there, but none of the foreign cars had really made it over yet.
Yeah.
And that's where World War II comes into play. So
they all get into the game with World War II. Did you know?
I didn't.
Speaking of World War II, say that 10 times real fast.
I'm not real good at R's anyways, so I cannot.
Exactly. So by the end of World War II, the Ford Motor Company produced more than 8,000 B-24 Liberator bombers.
That is a lot of
bombers. They made airplanes.
Yeah.
Ford.
Yeah.
And you know Rosie the Riveter?
Yes, I do know Rosie. We're good friends.
So Rosie the Riveter, she was on war bonds, and they painted her on planes. She's actually named after a lady in one of the Ford plants. Her name was Rose Will, and she was actually a riveter. She was chosen to become the face for this war bond campaign, and people know about Rosie the Riveter to this day.
That's like Aunt Jemima, who was selected to be the face of the pancake mix.
She's the We Can Do It. The girl, the lady with the red bandana in her hair, and We Can Do It.
If you want to learn about pancake mix and its introduction to the world in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, check out our episode on that.
You were really peddling these.
Well, it was a good. It was good. So World War II shows up, and not long after, in like 1940, our friend, longtime listener, President Roosevelt, wanted William Kunsen,
Yep, you got it.
GM's president, to control American military production for the war. So that's a pretty big honor.
I'd say.
Now he's the president, but he's like, meh, I guess I'll quit and do that, serve my country. Fun fact, he left his job as president to work for the government for a salary of $1. $1. What a good guy. So go ahead.
Chrysler gets in the game with the war effort. And the crazy thing was, you're thinking Chrysler, they're going to make really crappy K cars, right? That they can drive around in. That's not what they did. Their most significant contribution was actually designing and manufacturing components for military radar systems.
Yeah. They also made the Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan.
Yeah.
And did all sorts of other good stuff.
And
the plant built more tanks than the Nazi regime during the entire period of the war.
And after the war, Chrysler continued to make missiles and space boosters for NASA.
Really?
Yep.
Do they still do this?
I have no idea.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
That's what the Google machine told me.
Oh, I love the Google machine.
It's very good.
Just a little bit more here before we get into a little bit more of the modern times, we'll say. So, like you mentioned, Ford Motor Company started making the bomber plane, right? The Willow Run bomber plant was created, and it was built in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Spelled Ypsilanti, because apparently that's a thing. Now, why did I call that out? Because that is the home of Eastern Michigan University.
Ooh.
If we have any listeners from Eastern Michigan, write into unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com and let us know.
Go Mud Ducks.
I think they must be the Mud Ducks. Okay, so as far as I can tell, nothing really happened for like 20 or 30 years until the 70s.
A bunch of bad cars, I think.
Bad cars. So a bunch of, bad cars. You're right.
Yeah.
Do you have any info between like the end of the war and the 70s?
I
saw nothing useful.
Not a bunch. I mean, there was a whole bunch of mergers, acquisitions. All three were busy buying up smaller companies that you had mentioned, that other percentage of the U.S. market. foreign cars started to make inroads.
Especially because of the fuel crisis,
exactly.
right?
So yeah, because everybody wanted to get away from these big V8 engines.
Were you around for that? I mean, I know you're old, but 70s still feels like you probably don't remember it.
Well. I remember whenever we would see like Toyotas and Nissans in like the late 70s, and it was unusual to see Toyotas and Nissans. It was kind of like I don't know. You just didn't see them that often. And then now all of a sudden that's all you see.
Huh, interesting. All right, before we go on with more modern times, let's take a break for this week's Luke's Rant.
So I'm keeping his rant super relative, and hopefully you agree with this because I know you have one of these. It's the price of trucks, James. So I have a truck. I have a little teeny tiny Toyota Tacoma. You have a big old honking Chevy something. Silverado. And I haven't bought a truck. So my truck is a 2013, I think. So I haven't bought a truck in whatever it is.
That's what mine is, I think.
6-7 years.
Yeah.
And when I bought it 7 years ago, this thing was like $30-some thousand. It's a mid-sized truck. It's a higher-end mid-sized truck, but still $30 grand.
That's because you're fancy. You got podcast money.
And then I'm thinking, you know what? I think I want to get a full-size truck because we do some camping. We're going to be getting a camper. I want to tow more efficiently. You know how much a full-size, like Ford F-150 that is moderately nice, quad cab, four-wheel drive? Guess.
$44,000.
44. You almost hit it on the nose. Like if you get like a stripped down anything, Ford, GM, Chevy, Dodge, it doesn't matter what the brand is. If you want 4 doors, 4-wheel drive, full size, it's minimum low $40,000.
Yeah.
And if you want like leather and then you want anything else, I can't believe that some some auto companies are like, you know what, we got to make like an everyday car, kind of like good old Henry Ford did with the Model T.
Yeah.
Something that's economical, something that works, something that, isn't too fancy schmancy. Even if you don't get a fancy schmancy vehicle, it's still, it's crazy. So so the price of vehicles is insane nowadays. And, we had to get a new car for my wife not too long ago, and we actually bought a used vehicle just because brand new vehicles were redonkulous.
They are redonkulous. That's the accurate word for it. Our good friend, Michael Smell, longtime not listener of the show, he bought a very fancy, I believe, Ford.
Well, he's a sales guy, so he makes all the money.
And it was super nice, but it was way expensive.
Yeah.
But even worse than that, we would just, for fun, look at Ford Raptors.
Yeah.
And they're just like... They're stupid. They're like the extreme sports of trucks or something.
They're like $50,000-$60,000.
They're more. I think they were like 70 to 90. It was dumb. It was stupid, and I hate you.
So someone needs to do something. Ford, GM, Chrysler, I know you're listening.
Down and make it electric.
And
good. How about that?
Perhaps.
A lot of rules. Okay, so moving on. After the 70s, whole bunch of nothing happened again as far as I could tell, until a really bad stretch there and call it 2008. So many of us probably remember the market crashing just a smidge, right? And some of the companies really impacted were the big three, our friends in the auto industry. So a combination of stuff like poor decision making by the industry exec, overspending, kind of like our friend who got the boot twice from GM, high prices of gas, bad products, that kind of factors into things, and then a bunch of external circumstances, which really they couldn't control.
Yep.
All resulted in what they call a once-in-a-generation credit crunch. And they needed, I think it was like an $80 billion lifeline available to them to make sure that these companies didn't go out of business or go bankrupt. So it was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, engineered by the Bush and Obama administrations in 08 and 09 to keep these things afloat. Because just think of the economic impact that would have if they went out.
And they just kept throwing money at them. So I think that number you mentioned was just the initial number. They needed additional reinvestment over the years, and they didn't get out of this until 2013 completely.
Yeah. So GM received $5 billion from the departing Bush admin, and then $17.2 from the Obama administration to keep things going. And so through 09 and 10, GM endured a, quote, government-backed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, reorganized, got rid of a lot of people, killed off unprofitable and unpopular brands like Saturn and Saab and Pontiac
I remember
and Hummer,
Saturns.
Do you remember when the H2 got real popular?
Yeah.
Man, that was the worst. And it devoted itself to producing more fuel-efficient cars and trucks. Did you ever look into the benefits of the GM union when they were going through all this stuff? It would be like they get retirement money forever, like all this big money after they retired. They would not let go of people. They would just have them go clean up a local park, and that would be your job, and they would get almost full pay. Like the benefits were crazy, which was a big problem.
Being a member of that union was a pretty powerful thing to be a member of.
Good news though, GM recorded its record profits the third quarter of 2015.
Finally.
Yeah.
So of all that money, the U.S. gave them just to GM. This doesn't include the other folks they bailed out. Do you know who didn't take the bailout?
Ford.
Ford did not take the bailout. They needed it, but they didn't take it.
Yeah.
But GM alone was loaned $50 billion. The U.S. government only got 39 back.
Of course.
Which is crazy.
Do you want to hear a fun story about all this?
Shoot.
So at the time, young James is watching the stock market drop and these big companies drop and says, wait a minute, 2 out of 3 of these car companies needs money and the other one doesn't. I'm going to buy me some Ford stock. Now, keep in mind, I was loaded with cash at that time.
Loaded.
And so I bought a little bit of Ford stock, $1,000 worth. And it eventually rocketed up to $3. Now, I don't have enough money when that is like big time profits for me. So I sell and I'm like, I just got $3,000 off of this stock market thing. That's amazing. Shortly after, it hit something like $15 or $17. And I was like, oh. So I could have had a lot more cashola on my first stock market opportunity, but I failed.
So in 2009, GM's stock closed at less than $1.
Yeah, I remember that. I thought about buying that too.
I mean, just buy a couple grand of it and just let it sit for the next 10 years.
It went out though. You lost all of it in that case. But that would have been if I had money.
Yeah.
Chrysler faced similar straits as GM, so it actually shut down all vehicle production in 2008 for $42 for 42 days, facing bankruptcy. It took $4 billion in loans. And then that's when they had their marriage with Fiat Automobiles in Italy in 2009. Fun fact about Chrysler. I mean, they probably don't think it's so fun, but Chrysler is in a unique category where it's the only of the big 3 that received 2 government bailouts. So the TARP got it, and as well as the Loan Guarantee Act, which they secured $1.5 billion from the government.
Yeah, it was. I remember that being such a fuss. Like it was like too big to fail, and people were arguing we should just let them fail. And I vividly remember those times.
Yeah. Fun fact about Ford: the family retains 40% of the corporation's voting rights.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought so.
I like that.
Yeah. Do you have any other info that you want to get into?
I got a couple like little miscellaneous things.
Let's hear it.
And these are more like rants more than anything. So Ford says back in 1985, going back in time a little bit, the Ford Taurus revolutionized the automobile industry because everything up until then was this big square car, and they came out with this basically curved, ugly blob of a car. I hated the Ford Taurus. I
had a friend who had a Taurus.
Oh my goodness! Yeah. I think it was the ugliest car ever made. Then in 1990, they introduced one of the best-selling SUVs of all time in the Ford Explorer, which later became known as the Ford Exploder, because if you remember the rollover issues they had, and it really wasn't even their problem. It was mostly the tires. I think Firestone was making their tires, and they had all kinds of problems, and lots of people getting killed and injured and hurt.
Not good.
And the rollover issues that the Ford Explorer was having. Let's see. We got a little bit of GM stuff here. So GM, this is relatively recent too. This is 2014 time frame. Remember the ignition problem they had?
Yeah.
So they had their ignition
Why are you being
defect.
so negative?
I'm sorry. We have to bring this to light. So as of December 15th, the faulty ignition switch has caused at least 124 deaths, according to the final report that happened there, which is bananas.
Banana.
And apparently there's a fund set up and all these families are getting at least $1 million. But unfortunately, every time they review these, they say that, you don't qualify because of this or that, or, you weren't the original owner. I forget what the criteria is, but basically a lot of families didn't get money, and they had loved ones die or get hurt.
That's crazy.
We got to give Lee Iacocca, just because I love his name. We got to give him a little bit of credit. So Lee Iacocca was fired from Ford. So what do? You put him in charge of Chrysler. And this is way back in 1978. And I just loved Lee Iacocca. And he basically turned Chrysler around. They dumped a bunch of cars. And then back in the late 90s, they actually partnered up with Daimler-Benz.
Wow.
50-50 partnership.
Yeah, those are good old days. And now, no longer.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, can we spend a couple minutes playing a fun game?
Oh, shoot.
All right, don't look at my screen, okay?
I won't look at your screen.
I'm going to tell you the brand. You're going to tell me the parent company.
Okay.
All right? This is an easy one. We'll start out with Acura.
Honda.
Alfa Romeo.
Peugeot.
Fiat. Audi.
Volkswagen.
BMW is pretty easy. Buick.
Chevy?
Well, Chevy is part of it, but yes, General Motors.
GM.
Dodge.
Dodge is Chrysler?
Fiat Chrysler, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Ford's pretty easy. Jaguar. Jaguar.
I think Jaguar's a part of Ford.
Tata Motors.
Tata's
an odd one to me. Land Rover is also part of Tata Motors.
Isn't Tata? They're based out of. They own a whole bunch of the miscellaneous ones, don't they?
They have so many other things as well. Rolls-Royce.
Rolls-Royce is Ford.
BMW Group.
BMW, okay.
Yeah. Subaru.
I think Subaru, right?
Yeah, good job. I was trying to trick you on that one.
Subaru's one of the few that they only have the one car, and yeah.
And last but not least, Volvo.
Volvo is Tata.
Zhang Geely Holding Group.
Nailed it.
Yeah. So, interesting stuff there.
Yeah.
It did not perform as well as I was hoping.
Thank you.
I picked the hard ones.
So hopefully you learned a little bit about the cars you may or may not be driving.
I hope so as well. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
I learned a lot about the cars doing this, or at least the history of the companies.
Yeah, it was interesting. And you get to think about all the engineering and all the things that they invented along the way. We didn't even get into the things that they invented, like the engines and the transmissions. And
we merely skimmed the surface, but you could certainly go do some research and let us know what we missed and got wrong, which people love to do by emailing us at unprofessionalengineering@gmail.com. All right, well, until next time.
See ya.